I'm Teresa Carraggio, and this is Third Paradigm. Today, my topic, in keeping with the Christmas spirit and conspiracy research, is that Jesus was the OG psyops. And I'm going to be starting by looking at a post that someone sent me by Naomi Wolf, and then I'll be categorizing the three different types of psyops that go back millennia. And I'll be looking at this from the perspective of my friend Joe Atwill's book, Caesar's Messiah, the Roman Conspiracy to Invent Jesus. This is juicy stuff that I spent over a decade of my life researching. So I'll try to summarize in a way that doesn't lose people, but also gives a sense of where all this is coming from. And it will not be where you think. Let's do this. My Substack friend from Japan, Stephen Martin, puts out Count Chocula, and he forwarded to that list a Naomi Wolf post that was called, "Must We Really Stand Up for the Truth?" In it, she talks about, in 2021, interviewing Dr. J. Bhattacharya. I'm sorry if I'm mispronouncing that. And she asked him, where do you find the courage? How do you stand up for what you believe despite all of the pressure? And after saying a few things that she wasn't quite satisfied with, he said humbly, "I am a Christian." And she said, "I also love Jesus. I think of him as my rabbi." And so she talks about that, and then she quotes from Walt Whitman and his phrase of the heirship and the heiressship of the world, by which she clarifies that he means America. In that, she talks about how this is a war against humanity and especially against religion and love and family and art and music and dance and theater and poetry and all the things that make us in the image of God. So when I look at that post, by my count, there are 5 different dogmas that Naomi is not willing to open up to question in order to find out what the truth is. And the first of those, of course, is Christianity. That when she talks about it and talks about loving Jesus, that's something that is a dogma for her. And then she talks about herself as being Jewish, and that's a second dogma. She talks about America, and that being the heirship and heirship of the world, which is a third dogma. And then she talks about all the different attacks on the different arts and how she sees that as what this is doing to us, that it is an attack on religion and family and all of those arts. And so my policy is that you should own your dogma. I don't think dogma is a bad thing, but I think we all have to be honest about what it is that we're not willing to raise to question. I say for myself that I only have one dogma, which is that I am no better than anyone else. Everything else I'm willing to raise to question. And it's on the basis of that dogma that I raise all of those other points to question. So let's look at what is the truth and what are the kinds of questions that we need to ask if we're going to be willing to stand up for the truth just because it's true and no other reason. In my book, How to Dismantle an Empire, I go through what were the real original gangster psyops, which are the two in Greek democracy, going back 3,500 years, followed soon after by the invention of money, of coinage. And those two are related because what democracy did was it defeated anarchy. It defeated the people who were rebelling against the landlords and the empire that was existing in Greece at the time. And what they did instead was that they co-opted the small landowners and made it so that they, by supporting the military, could then become part of that democracy themselves. It excluded, of course, women, also slaves, the conquered, the servants, the landless, and those who didn't have enough property to be able to get the first rung of that ladder. But what it created was the mercenary warrior, which every other lord in the area wanted to have, wanted to buy. And so what they did was that they created taxation by making the coins that they got through plunder and put that into small amounts that they then collected back. And this gave them a self-perpetuating machine so that it made all of us complicit in the act of conquest and blinded us to the fact that we were being part of that. So democracy took the landowners and made them part of the hierarchy, which is the inheritance order of the archons, which are the rulers. And then money and coinage made all of the rest of us complicit without our ability to say no. We had to contribute to the material support for those militaries in order to get those coins, because that's what enabled us to not become slaves ourselves. So in both the political realm and in the economic realm, those are both ways in which we have been fooled. As I've said before, I believe there is only one war, and it's always empire versus sovereignty. And that's why I think it's critical to understand that democracy was on the side of empire. It was something that made empire much more stable. It was never on the side of giving power to the people and supporting sovereignty. In the same way, money was not designed in order to make trade easier for the common people. It was designed to increase the power and the wealth of those who were the rulers. Now let's look at religion and let's look at Christianity. The important question here is, was it designed in order to be something that helps the people, the common people, claim their own sovereignty, or was it on the side of empire? That's why this is such an important question to ask. It's not just theological or something that is an empty philosophical question. We need to know whether we've been fooled for 2,000 years into thinking that Jesus was a man of the people who was supporting them and giving them the truth that will set you free, or was he actually an agent of the empire? Religion is something that's always fascinated me. I attended Catholic grade school, high school, and college, which I entered as a religion major. 20 odd years ago, I started getting deep into researching. I was an oblate at a monastery, and I started going to something called the Jesus Seminars, which are a worldwide collection of Bible scholars who will present their research, and then they'll vote on whether they believe that something is true, not true, partly true. And so this is something that I was really very deep into. And I walked into a bookstore one day and picked up Caesar's Messiah and thought, oh, that's kind of an intriguing concept. And I started reading it, and I think I literally threw it across the room. I said, this is nonsense. This idea that Christianity was just made up by the empire, that makes no sense to me. And then I picked up a couple of other books and started reading them. One of them was John Dominic Crossan, and he is, I would say, the world's most eminent Bible scholar. He's one of the two people who started the Jesus Seminars. And what I started reading in there is how in ancient Rome, what archaeologists have found is that the sayings that we attribute to Jesus are things that were as ubiquitous as advertising, but they didn't mean Jesus. They meant Caesar. And these would be things that were verbatim, things that I had memorized in Catholic school about one true God, begotten, not made, one in being with the Father, all the virgin birth. Every detail matched exactly. And so I said, well, that's kind of interesting. And then I picked up Elaine Pagel's On the Origins of Satan. And it started talking about how Satan was an invention that described the intimate enemy, the enemy within, which was the Jews who were specifically in rebellion against Rome at the time. And that was what Joe Atwill talks about in Caesar's Messiah. So to understand the story of Jesus, you have to put it in historical context. What was happening at that time in Judea? There was a revolt that was going on that was spreading like wildfire. And that revolt had a militant leader. It had two militant leaders of the Zealots, or the Sicarii, as they were called, because they had the Sicca. And the Sicca was a short dagger where they would go where they were being betrayed by the higher ups in the temple, and they would wait for festivals, and they would go and stab them and then melt back into the crowd. So this is something that was being successful. It was standing up to the Roman Empire, who had put their eagle, the golden eagle, on top of the temple. So these two teachers were Judas the Sicariot, which means the assassin. Now, if you take Judas Sicariot and you transpose two letters, of course, you get Judas Iscariot. The other one was Zadok the Pharisee, and Zadok's followers were the Sadducees. So Saduk is another way of saying his name. So they were the ones who had their students climb the temple in broad daylight and saw down that golden eagle. What it meant was that they, of course, were tortured, but didn't seem to show any pain, that it didn't seem to be something that bothered them. And so that was something that allowed this movement to have incredible courage, because it seemed like there was something that they knew that no one else did. And so that's why they were seen as demons, because they were impervious to the kinds of threats of loss and death and torture, and it made them fearless in battle. And then in the year 66 of the Common Era, what seemed to be impossible happened. The Judeans won. The Zealots won. They kicked out the Roman Empire. They took over the temple and inhabited it, and the temple was being used as the treasury for all of the wealth that was being sacked from the common people. So during that time, they were able to rule as they intended and have it be a sovereign city, which ended up spreading to all the other provinces who were saying, if Judea can do it, then so can we. And Samaria, when we talk about the Good Samaritan, that is also another province that was rebelling, that was against the elites. In the year 70, the Roman general Vespasian was sent to place Jerusalem under siege. And so he came, and one of the Judean generals was Josephus. And Josephus gave up his territory within, I think it was a couple of days. And one of the things that they did was that they would draw straws to see who would kill the other so that they wouldn't be left in order to have anyone who could betray them to the enemy. And so they drew straws until it got down to Josephus and one other person, and he killed the other one and said, okay, we're good now. That's done. And then he, when he was captured, ended up saying to Vespasian, you think you've captured me, but really I have been sent as a messenger to you, because these silly Judeans, they believe this prophecy that the Messiah is going to come on Judean soil. And they think that that means it's going to be one of them. But hey, here you are. You're on Judean soil. It's you. You're the Messiah that they've talked about. You are destined to be their emperor. So that flattery got him to be left alive. And when they did place Jerusalem under siege and ended up succeeding with that siege, after a very long time, many, many, many months, which I think is another story, then Vespasian ends up becoming the emperor. And in gratitude to Josephus, he adopts Josephus as his son. So Josephus becomes the son of Caesar, which is also considered to be the son of God. That Caesar was considered God and was worshipped in all the temples. If you were part of the Roman Empire, that needed to be worship of Caesar as God. So Josephus ends up betraying his own people. He ends up going into Jerusalem, and something happens which is not disclosed in the War of the Jews, which is his history of that time. But I think that was a betrayal that ended up making it so that that siege was unlocked. And as they said, the streets ran red with blood, and anyone who wasn't killed when they were weary of killing was made into a slave or sent back to be tortured. That's what Josephus did to his own people. At the same time, during the siege, there was a Jewish rabbi who had himself lowered down the wall in a coffin. And then he went to Vespasian and begged him to allow him to stay alive so that he and his scholars could preserve the Jewish scriptures. And so the version that we have of Jewish scriptures is written by someone who deserted his own people and left them to die in order to beg mercy from the person who was coming to defeat them and destroy them. That's the person who has edited and kept that tradition in whatever form we have it today. For Josephus, he's written the War of the Jews. And what Joe Atwill does is that he takes the War of the Jews and puts it side by side with the Gospels. And he looks at the typology. Now, there's different ways of looking at something that's called like the Markan sandwich, which means that you start a story here, you interject something different here, and then you conclude it over here. That same pattern is used in War of the Jews and is used all over in the Gospels, which is why it's called the Markan sandwich. There's also word sort, where you can look at the chances of certain words being said in a certain order and how likely that is to be by chance. And what he's shown is that the same patterns are there in War of the Jews as are in the Gospels. What Joe looks at is the Gospels being written really as a parody of this war, and that what they did was trick the people into having a non-militant Messiah, which is what they were looking for. What they were looking for was someone who was going to lead them into victory against the empire. But what Jesus is a pacifist who says, give to Caesar what's Caesar's, who says, turn the other cheek, who says, return your slaves, that this is how the world is. And he forgives the Romans, but he does not forgive the other Jews. The other Jews end up becoming the demons. They become the bad thief and the good thief. And I've written a paper where I take the word thief and robber, and I look at how many times it shows up in War of the Jews. And in every instance, what that word means is revolutionary. They were the soldiers. They were the ones who were the rebels. Rebel is the robbers. And one of the reasons that it is because the way that they turned these people who were in authority into an ordinary person just like them was to steal their robes. The robes were the symbol of their authority. So when you have the Good Samaritan who finds the rich person on the road, that's someone who had been stolen because the rebels were taking away that authority. And the Good Samaritan is the one who says, no, I'm on the side of the empire. This is a 1,000-piece puzzle, one of which I just finished, and I've been working on it for a long time, and I could go on here telling you all of these different pieces and how they fit together. What the picture shows, though, is that the Bible is upside down and inside out. It has taken the villains and turned them into heroes. And I think that Jesus is a representation of Josephus himself. Then you take all of the heroes and they've been turned into villains. People like Judas, the Iscariot, and Zadok, the Pharisee. And so those have been turned into the demons so that we are getting exactly the wrong message. We're getting the message that this is a God who demands sacrifice and who has heroes of one person who God loved more than all the rest of us put together. That's the kind of story that it's tricking us into, rather than seeing that we are the ones we've been waiting for. We are the Christ. We together are the Christ. It's not one person. That's contradictory. That's not the kind of God that I could believe in, because then I would have to believe that by being Christian, as Naomi Wolf implies, or Jewish, that I am better, I'm more moral, I'm more likely to stand up for the truth than someone else. And that contradicts my single dogma. I think we need to be taking a closer look at all the different forms of psyops and look at how democracy has replaced anarchy or government by the people, and how money has replaced something that could be our own unit of trade and our own way of creating commerce and taking responsibility for ourselves. And in this case, Christianity has taken over the idea of God. It's made it where you either believe in that God, a God who demands blood sacrifice, or you believe in no God at all. And that's what psyops does. It limits your choices and makes it their way or the highway. That's not good enough. To follow this up, I'm going to recommend two older ones. One is The Crisis of Meaninglessness, which is on Brett Weinstein and Heather Heying, and it talks about the religions of altruism that developed at the same time as coinage. And then Kali and Ultimate Reality to show why the zealots may have been onto something that we've forgotten, and that we can stand up and be fearless. Thank you.